Get started. Hi everyone again. We have, including us, 7 audiences, but it's fine. I am sure the one who are now listening us will be enjoy it. So I don't mind how many people we are here. So thank you, Professor Jonathan Lawrence. Your book is Coping with Defeat. Sunni Islam, Catholicism and the Nation State. I have been amazed, I have to admit that one, with the book. It is really covering the almost 5 or 6 centuries, how the religious institutions reacted with the new developments and the new form of political entities reacted against the institutionalized religions. So I don't want to lose too much time because we have just half an hour. Actually, this is the last session. If you want, we can just extend the time frame. So if you don't mind, I would like you to give us 30 minutes at most, the intro, what the book is about. And then I personally will be started with my lots of questions. Thank you very much. I will give the word to you now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance and to get to know your organization. I will share my screen with you.
Yeah, you are permitted to share screen. I think it won't be a problem.
Okay, it's asking me to just grant permission. Okay. So the book is, as you can see from the table of contents here, is rather vast, and it covers many centuries, and it makes a grand comparison between the trajectory of the organized religions of Roman Catholicism on the one hand and Sunni Islam on the other. I am going to concentrate on one slice of the book in order to keep it manageable. And so I'm going to start here, which is to say current events. A century after Afghan independence from British rule, and now 20 years after 9/11, the US military withdrawal signals a definitive rearrangement of the old colonial puzzle. To the horror of many observers, the Taliban are implementing their quote-unquote model society governed by the Holy Quran, the Hadith, and Sunnah alone. And to the satisfaction of other observers, they will thus be reviving the first Islamic caliphate since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Having defeated foreign military occupation, which Al-Qaeda and ISIS failed to do, the resurgent Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is now the highest profile Sunni response to the Shia revolution in Iran. Now, there is no consensus on the necessity of such a polity, but its persistence throughout Islamic history is unavoidable. The de facto existence of a Sunni caliphate today thus closes a 150-year bracket of Western intervention against such a thing. One need not approve of the Taliban regime to recognize its place in Islamic history. Now, the Taliban's position atop the heap of pretenders is the ironic outcome of a 19th century campaign by European empires against the Ottoman Caliphate. The British Empire, which was, of course, at the time governing India, what became Pakistan and Bangladesh as well, sought to separate over 100 million Muslim subjects across North Africa, the Middle East, India, and Afghanistan from their ties to Ottoman Islam. And this was also true of the French, Dutch, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, etc. empires. And here you can see just how large the Muslim populations of the European empires was with respect to that of the Ottoman Empire. Now, these European empires feared the caliph's influence because he was the lone independent Muslim power of the era. So they severed all lines to Istanbul's spiritual leadership, and they did so in favor of local alternatives. So in the case of India, colonial officials worked to replace the caliph in Friday prayers and to substitute the Turkish fez with the local turban. Now, this created breathing room in India for Deobandi seminaries like the Darul Uloom, which you can see on the right. Now, that was an Anglo-Muslim college separately chartered for Indian and Afghan ulema, sought to turn the loyalty away from the Turkish Sultan Caliph and towards Her Majesty's government. But this, the Dar ul-Ulum, proved far more popular. And in fact, the spin-off madrasas that multiplied after the partition of India spread beyond Pakistan into the tribal areas in Afghanistan, where later the Taliban movement was incubated. Now, contemporary US observers will recognize the pattern of unintended consequences across the British Empire. In the Middle East, London upended Ottoman rule with the promise of Arab sovereignty and commitment to transfer Islam's holy cities to Arab hands. Once they were liberated from Ottoman rule, however, the cities fell to unintended successors. In Jerusalem, the British created a new independent position of Mufti. But when he died, suddenly he was replaced by his brother, who later allied with Nazi Germany. The installation of the British ally Hussein bin Ali as the sovereign over Mecca and Medina also did not last long before he was ousted by the Saudi royal family and Wahhabi fundamentalists. Now, this pattern was repeated across the European empires. Now, the Sultan Caliphs of the late Ottoman Empire could, of course, never claim universal appeal, but they did build the largest network of mosques, charities, seminaries, and ulema ever assembled. Now, the spiritual leadership of the Ottoman Caliphate targeted audiences that lived almost entirely outside Ottoman borders. So the outreach was global, it was relatively moderate, and it was modernizing and embracing of new technologies, from train travel, as you can see on the right, to photography, as of the Kaaba, and the telegraph, which all enhanced the international profile. Soon after being dislodged from Islam's holiest sites by the European empires, however, the caliphate, of course, was terminated abruptly. It was Turkish statesmen who pulled the trigger, but it was European occupation around the Sunni world, from North Africa to India to Java, that had already hollowed out the institution. Now, non-Arab Muslim voices, such as the Khilafah movement in India, were unhappy with this because they were attached sentimentally to Ottoman Islam. Many Arab Muslims, in turn, felt betrayed by Great Britain's fleeting interest in their cause. They had toppled one caliphate without guaranteeing the rise of another. So it's no accident that the enduring brotherhoods of international political Islam, the Jamiat Tabligh, the Ikhwan, first blossomed where the British launched their assault upon the last caliphate. So for nearly a century now, Islam's international status has continued to pay a steep price for this external intervention. The caliphate's absence is a central reason for the ensuing fitna, or communal strife, including the spread of political Islam and religiously motivated violence that grew fiercer over the 20th century and, of course, came to a new peak in the 21st. The missing caliphate trapped Muslim communities in a purgatory populated by transnational pretenders like Yusuf al-Qaradawi or Osama bin Laden, or as pictured here, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi on the one hand, and on the other, the state-appointed ulama and national ministers of Islamic affairs in Muslim-majority states on the other, as you can see in the open letter that they formulated in response to al-Baghdadi's caliphate. Now, more than half of the world's Muslims today reside in countries where Islam is partly or fully established as an official religion, and religious exercise remains subject to a state monopoly, with few or no private Islamic spaces permitted outside the home. That is, there is no religious civil society. Now, each of these ministries' religious legitimacy is actively contested by non-governmental movements nonetheless, from the election-oriented Muslim Brotherhood, as well as from violent rivals like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. So keeping that in mind, I'd like to now make a very big and perhaps imperfect analogy. The end of the Ottoman Caliphate left the Muslim world in the throes of what we could call the Islamic equivalent of the Roman question. The Roman question refers to the period after the unification of Italy, when the Pope was deprived of territorial sovereignty for the first time in over a millennium. Now, after decades of opposition to democratization, trying to stop the separation of church and state in Catholic Europe, the Vatican wound up isolated, militarily, politically, diplomatically, and outside its walls, at the height of anti-clericalism, governments cut off their national hierarchies from Rome and required loyalty affirmations from priests and bishops, and they strictly limited the activities of dioceses and seminaries. Now, that top-down state control of internal appointments and the dispossession of church holdings in the late 19th century is analogous to the situation of Islam across much of the Muslim world today. The main distinction with Islam is that the Vatican walls were never breached, and the Pope was allowed to remain in Rome. Now, resolving Catholicism's place in the international order required including the Vatican as an equivalent counterpart in that system. That is, allowing for the existence of an earthly polity under sovereign papal rule. Now, at first, the Vatican city-state gained international recognition slowly, and mostly just from other Catholic majority countries. Now, the creation of Vatican City was not a silver bullet, but it granted the church a spiritual afterlife in the nation-state era. The papacy remained an unreconstructed anti-democratic force for decades, but it was no longer at war with the emerging political order. In the next step towards civil coexistence of state and religion, governments in Europe restored organizational independence to Catholic officialdom. And in one country after another, the church won back autonomy over its internal affairs, from clerical training to bishop nominations, even in places that had banned the hierarchy for centuries. Now, the soft restoration of Roman Catholicism reverted control over religious matters from state oversight to independently appointed community leaders, despite their keeping their foreign ties to the Vatican. Now, all this was possible because the vanquishing of the Pope's temporal power left the papacy in place. It entered the New World Order as a sovereign state with its global community united under pontifical guidance, albeit on a strictly symbolic basis. The Pope has hundreds of millions of followers and admirers, but he governs fewer than 1,000 citizens. Now, this outcome, which was at once triumphant but also circumscribed, mitigated the kind of politicization of religion that took place in the Muslim world. No such bridge to the past was projected on the Mediterranean's southern and eastern banks. The idea of a Vatican-style administration for Islam did arise during the Allied occupation of Istanbul after World War I. The British and French leaders hesitated to keep the caliph in place, but they were constrained by native public opinion in their colonies. And anyway, they could not agree on where to move him. Following the last caliph's exile, there were many voices claiming the legacy to the seat. But in fact, the Saudi government and the Turkish governments scuttled any attempt to designate a successor caliph at international conferences that were held in Jerusalem and Cairo, and they thus ensured that the caliph's seat would remain empty. Now, the absence of a consensual ruler to receive the Ummah's pledge of loyalty and benediction left the basic premise of state legitimacy open for debate. In other words, who bestows validity upon whom? Should Islamic resources be mobilized in service of the state, or vice versa? Now, Al-Qaeda and ISIS have certainly offered their views to that question, but now it's the Taliban who are offering an answer. Whereas the Vatican city-state has only a handful of inhabitants on an area the size of a city park, however, the Emirate of Afghanistan has 40 million citizens in a land that is twice the size of Germany. So you can be sure that national governments in the region, but also around the Muslim world, will be monitoring developments attentively. How will that take place? Well, the religious authority that was once exercised by Istanbul in the Balkans, down the Arabian Peninsula, across North Africa, is now siloed within dozens of ministries and agencies across the national governments of the Muslim majority world. So contemporary states are used to protecting Muslim citizens from foreign religious influences and from belligerent jihadism, having recently faced themselves unwanted Shia or Wahhabi proselytism, as well as sometimes terrorist attacks. Now, these bureaucracies can seem unusual or unnatural to some European or American observers, but the Islamic services that they provide meet a public demand for prayer space and religious education and for the basic rights of prayer, birth, marriage, and death. It is helpful to think of these Islamic affairs agencies as ministries of spiritual self-defense. To forgo them in this international context would be the equivalent of unilateral disarmament. Now, religious spending and public policies towards Islam have varied significantly. Not all of these ministries were created equal. Here you can see there are two distinct groups that form, in particular, Morocco and Turkey on the one hand, with higher levels of spending, and Algeria and Tunisia on the other. Now, the 20th century secularist governments did not all leave behind conditions that could reproduce a national core of ulama and imams. Now, where prayer leaders are better funded and have more mosques and basic religious education, governments have had defenses ready against spikes in transnational extremist threats. On the other hand, policies that purposely downplayed religion, shuttering seminaries, providing inadequate mosques and prayer leaders, left citizens vulnerable to the transnational movements that thrive on the fertile ground where religious traditions have been totally uprooted. So there is still excessive state control that too often permeates the actual religious content and sometimes the personnel decisions. And that can reach from the national ulama councils all the way down to the Quran course in the neighborhood mosque. Here you can see some recent investments from Algeria and Tunisia in improving their infrastructure closer to the levels of what Morocco and Turkey had achieved. But when Islamic affairs administrations are used in a partisan fashion, as still takes place in many of these countries, the state oversight is not only a remedy to sedition, but it also becomes the arm of an oppressive apparatus. Now, in the case of the Roman Catholic Church, what had been once extreme anti-clerical policies gave way to a new equilibrium, and after rejecting democratic elections, Christian democratic political parties joined parliamentary life. Religious service provision to